So you already read the title, and full disclosure, this is not about the climate. It's about a different dimension of sustainability. I feel responsible that I have to say this in the beginning to manage expectations. And specifically, it's about the intersection of regional revitalization and sustainability, and even more specifically, it's about the intersection of two policies that already exist and that have been in place for a while, namely the hometown tax, or the Furusato program, and the promotion of sub-municipal civic self-governance in rural Japan. And more broadly, it's about a question that is, I think, relevant for this whole conference, and that's responsibility. So it's about the question, who is responsible for sustaining rural livelihoods in aging Japan, and how do these responsibilities shift? Thankfully, Sebastian already said a few things here. I can keep this really short, but I think we're all aware of the fact that rural areas in Japan face long-term and interrelated challenges of aging, depopulation, and economic dependency, which are connected, obviously. And by 2021, the Japanese government counted more than half of its municipalities as depopulating regions. And the problem with these regions is that they are depopulating, but people are still living there. So it's around 66,000 settlements, or around 10 million people who live in these regions. And many of these settlements face quite existential threats to their livelihoods and very much sustainability. There's limited access to public and private services, especially elderly care. It's unequal access also within municipalities. There are limited opportunities for higher education, especially, and there's also increasing vulnerability for disasters, and not just for disasters occurring, but especially in the aftermath, so delayed reconstruction. So in many ways, the social, the economic, and the ecological sustainability of many of these settlements is at risk, and that is not a new problem, and it is also a problem that has been amplified in some ways by political reforms, specifically in the mid-2000s, decentralization and fiscal cuts, which have led to the so-called Heisei wave of municipal mergers, which meant that many rural towns and villages in rural Japan became part of larger, more heterogeneous, widespread municipalities. And what that amounts to is what some people call the retreat of the state from rural peripheries, or the creation of an empty public space in many rural areas where the state has retreated. And that, of course, gives extra weight to the question, who then is responsible for sustaining rural livelihoods in these aging peripheries from which the state has retreated, which directly refers to the fact, how can we actually create communities in which we can continue to live? It's kind of interesting, the Japanese version is a little bit different from the English version here. So the Japanese government has a number of direct responses to this question, and I want to talk about one response specifically, and that's regional management organizations. So under the broad Chiho Sosei strategy since around 10 years, the central government has been promoting these regional management organizations, which are roughly defined as civic, resident-led self-governance organizations to resolve local challenges and preserve local activities and livelihoods, to sustain rural livelihoods. They typically operate at the sub-municipal level, so it's usually school districts, historical villages, pre-merger towns and villages, not exclusively, but mainly in the rural empty space I've just mentioned. We can see it's a relatively successful policy program, if you will, so the number of regional management organizations has increased rapidly over the past 10 years, and it obviously is a kind of responsibility shift. So these organizations, often with the local state or on behalf of the local state, take over important functions. Many of them are involved in simple social welfare services or supplementing services. They're often involved in disaster prevention or more simple community maintenance, mobility services, etc. And it's very important for now to mention that although this is civic self-governance, explicitly defined as civic self-governance, it's very much a political project. So most of these IMO are directly or indirectly created by local governments within sub-municipal civic self-governance frameworks, and they also often rest on pre-existing groups like neighborhood associations or machizokuri groups. So I will return to these organizations in a minute, but first talk about a different policy program that seems not too related, and that's the Fudo-Satonose program, or the hometown tax. I'm sure you've heard about it. It's another response to fiscal retrenchment and rural decline. Actually exists since 2008, but as you can see here in the development, really took off under the second Abe administration within the broader Chiho-Sose framework. This is another shift of responsibility, this time for allocating tax money from the government towards individual citizens. So in essence, citizens can redirect a share of their local tax burden from the place they live to a place they choose, typically in exchange for a thank you gift. So someone living in, let's say, downtown Yokohama could say, I'm donating, let's say, 20,000 yen to maybe the place where I come from in the countryside to a local government to use it. As you can already sense, it has a strong redistributive objective, this policy, and it's directly and indirectly linked also to ideas of sustaining rural livelihoods, and very specifically in the thank you gifts, very often connected to positive images of sustainable goods, circular economy, etc. And it also, if you look at the literature on it, it does work in a way, so it has been redistributing funds from metropolitan to rural areas, but as Rausch and Koji and many others have argued, it kind of works for the wrong reasons. So it's driven by consumption, it's driven by the thank you gift trade, and it has thrown struggling local governments in competition with each other for who has the best thank you gifts. So the money goes to rural areas, but not necessarily to those places that would need it the most, but those places that can market themselves successfully. So this is more or less established in the literature on Chiho-Sose and the Fudo-Satonose program, but I'm actually interested in how this policy is linked to other parts of this Chiho-Sose agenda, and argue that there is an emerging link between Fudo-Satonose and the promotion of sub-municipal civic self-governance, and this link comes from the fact that these regional management organizations I just talked about tend to have not so much money. So they strongly depend on local government subsidies. It's a bit blurry. Another major source of income are membership fees, and both of these sources of income are limited. So according to these annual surveys on RMO, many of them report financial shortcomings, a chronic lack of funding, which means they cannot realize the projects they would like to realize, and also kind of ironically threatens the sustainability of these very organizations that are meant to sustain rural livelihoods at the sub-municipal level. And the central government, in the spirit of shifting responsibility, wants these organizations to diversify sources of income, find new sources of income, maybe from service provision or for-profit activities, and many RMOs simply cannot do this. So much of what these organizations are doing is not for profit, or they lack the organizational capacities to gain these sources of income. And in this situation, the Fudo-Satonose program, the hometown tax, can emerge as a potential alternative source of income for RMO, linking these policies. I should mention how I know this and why I talk about this. This is just one chapter of a larger research, a book project I'm working on now, which is on the institutional origins and political promotion of regional management organizations and civil society-state relations in rural Japan. So I've been analyzing government reports and surveys, and I've been doing interviews, document collection, and observation in 3 nested case studies in 3 parts of Japan. Starting already in 2018, interrupted by a pandemic. And in 2018, Isaac and I were doing field research in Ida City and first stumbled across this link between RMO and Fudo-Satonose. We thought it's interesting. And then later I realized it is not just happening there, it actually happens in other places. I found it in other data. I got more interested and identify at least 2 patterns through which RMO access and compete for Fudo-Satonose funds. Okay, I'm going to introduce 2 patterns, and the first pattern actually is not that important, but I still have to talk about it to understand why it is not that important. And that is actually some RMO actually engage in independent self-promotion under the Fudo-Satonose system. So some RMO and affiliated organizations directly appeal for these funds. And the most famous example for that is the Kuchinai Machizukuri Kyogikai. That's an RMO in Kuchinai district, which is a tiny part of Kitakami city in Iwate. And this RMO cooperates with an NPO, the NPO Kuchinai, and the NPO produces local specialties like these gyoza here, for example, markets them through the Fudo-Satonose system, and then the money that comes in is directly used to fund social welfare services. Specifically here, a mobility service for older residents which cannot use their own cars anymore, and there is no public transportation. So you can imagine that the government loves this idea. This is about a civic organization teaming up with an NPO, producing something to supplement public services. So I found this case in government-sponsored reports as a model for other RMO. The problem is that most of these organizations cannot actually do the same for the reasons I've just talked about. So the majority of RMO actually do not even produce anything they could market through the Furusato system. I didn't put it here, but over 90% of RMO do not even have a legal status, so they cannot actually receive donations directly, and many of them also do not have a potential partner like the NPO Kuchinai. So direct promotion actually is not working, and we cannot really expect it to work much. So then the question is, so what? Right? Is this actually a non-starter? But I think this is now where it gets really interesting, because while RMO cannot directly access these Furusato donations, there are local governments which actually help them to get access to these donations because they create rules and practices and frameworks to help them. That can happen indirectly, and it's really hard to see and to find. As you probably know, if you have ever used the Furusato system, you cannot only choose a local government you want to give money to, you can also, in most cases, choose a policy you want to support at this place. So governments have policy choice menus, and a popular item on these policy choice menus is Machizukuri and Shimin-Katsudo. And behind this often hides the promotion of regional management organization. Can hide, right? We don't know that. But the more interesting example for me is some municipalities actually give donors the opportunity to select a civic self-governance organization and a certain district and say, I want my money to go this civic initiative and support this civic initiative. And that happens, for example, in the city of Ena, which is one of my field studies, case studies. It's a very typical case study for me. It's a merged municipality. It's very large. It has 13 sub-municipal districts. Each district is represented by one civic district management council. And if you donate money to Ena city, at the city homepage, you can actually choose to support one of these district management councils so that they can realize additional projects that they cannot realize with the government subsidies they receive. And the trick here is that the local government receives the money, so it goes to local government accounts, and then the local government channels it to these district management councils upon request. So it acts as an intermediate actor to make sure that these organizations can actually receive these additional funds. You can probably guess what is happening in a situation like this, and that is the notion of competition is shifted through the sub-municipal civic level. So this is some data from Kushihara village. It's one of those districts in Ena. I did an interview 2 years ago and asked about this system. And obviously, it's now inter-district competition that drives these activities. So people were telling me, yeah, we should do better. We don't get enough money through the system. So we need to advertise our specific causes. So as a reaction to this notion in Kushihara, the civic district management council set up a PR campaign asking people not only to give money to Kushihara district, but also to, as thank you gifts, select products made in this village specifically. And there are more problems than competition. Another problem is the amount of money that comes in is actually very small. So it's just a few million yen, and it fluctuates not only between districts, but it also fluctuates over time, which means long-term sustainable planning is very much not possible with this kind of money, and it's being used for additional short-term projects or one-time projects mostly. Right? So that's a major problem in all of the cases I found. I'm running out of time, so I'm only introducing one more because it has a slightly different idea that I think is quite interesting. That's Ida, where we found this in the first place. Ida is very similar. It's also a giant merged municipality. It has 20 sub-municipal districts, each district represented by a civic Machizukuri Iinkai. They also get most of their funding from the local government, but Ida City also wants them to appeal for extra funds through the Furusato system. But in Ida, it's slightly different. In Ida, donors can make a choice. They can either support Ida City, the local government, in the classical fashion and then receive a thank you gift. Or they can go to a separate homepage where all these districts introduce their own causes and characteristics, and they can donate to one of these districts, but then it's decoupled from the thank you gift trade. So the local government does not want these districts to compete for thank you gifts, and when we did this interview then we were surprised about the system, and people told us from the Shiaksho, well, we are returning to the original spirit of the Furusato Nose program, so you get a letter, a token of appreciation in return. The problem though is that the underlying problems are quite similar, so the volume of money that comes into is relatively small. It fluctuates a lot between districts and also over time. So again, it's very hard to do it's actually impossible to do any long-term planning with this. And some of my respondents said, well, we can't compete with thank you gifts, so what it becomes is a popularity contest, right? Who is more visible, whose cause is more deserving of support. Okay, I will wrap this up in a brief summary. So I would argue that responsibilities for sustaining rural livelihoods since decentralization reforms in the past 20 years have been shifting in many ways. And I would argue that some of these shifts are interrelated in interesting ways that we do not even see at first sight. And two of these shifts are from the local state towards RMO, towards sub-municipal self-governance organizations, and from the government towards individual taxpayers. So we can see that as a next step, now it is civic, sub-municipal civic self-governance organizations also taking part in this tournament financing. I think this is really interesting just as a finding, so I was really intrigued when I found it, but I also think it has some takeaways from a more comparative perspective on civil society-state relations in Japan, because what we're seeing here are distinct variations of policy trends that occur elsewhere as well. These are two very common responsibility shifts. RMO are a variant of what we can call localism or community responsibilization, very popular especially in England, but also other parts of Europe and the US. And the Furusato Nose is a variant of civic crowdfunding, so the use of crowdfunding for projects that produce community or quasi-public assets, which has become popular especially in Southern Europe and US after the Lehman shock in times of extreme austerity. And both of these shifts occur in Japan, but they occur in a specific way. So the state shifts responsibility, but at the same time continues to play a strong role in patterning and molding and guiding civic engagement. So RMO are not just civic self-governance bodies, they have a very strong relationship with the local state, and the Furusato Nose is a government-administered civic crowdfunding system that works different from other civic crowdfunding systems. And this patterning, I think, is really exemplified in the municipal frameworks that facilitate access to donations. But then it's not civic initiatives individually appealing for extra money, it's actually local governments that are making this possible, for example, by acting as intermediate actors to make it happen. So, almost at the end, the question, of course, needs to be asked if this is now helping and sustaining rural livelihoods. I would be quite not so optimistic about this. What I think I can say from my data is that this is an increasing trend. So we first found it a few years ago, and in 2023, for the first time in the data on RMO, I found donations as one of the main sources of income for now 17% of RMO. It's happening. The government actually advertises it as a model, so I think it's an increasing trend. But it shifts the problem of the Furusato Nose system from the intermunicipal level to the sub-municipal level and from the state towards civic self-governance organizations, which struggle with quite similar problems there. And I do think, and I just added this because I think it's an overlapping theme, overarching theme of this conference, it falls into a broader political frame for really not governing sustainability, but rather nudging, if it's corporations or communities or individuals, to do something towards an end, that where the state defines a direction or a goal, but really not, shies away from actually making, for example, a financial commitment. And I'm really not sure if that is an efficient way to actually realize these goals. Thank you.